Hello. I wonder. Oh, there it is. Okay, it shows that it's up. Hello, this is my little research presentation on the loss of biodiversity, which is one of the chapters that we covered over a little bit. And we even talked about how biodiversity is not necessarily just species biodiversity, but can be biodiversity within genetic sequences and stuff like that. Today, I will be talking about biodiversity in the sense of species to biodiversity and especially within wildlife. Before I go on, biodiversity has a not very basic definition. Um, the actual dates for biodiversity are hard to come by in terms of an actual history line other than extinction events and then potentially like important species that have gone extinct from random periods and periods of time. It's definitely a temporal idea. So for the history of biodiversity, how to go to the next slide. Okay, it's that button apparently. For some dates on the history of biodiversity, I went ahead with actually not even regulation, because there's not a whole ton of regulation when it comes to biodiversity. Things that humans have done in relation to biodiversity. So first, we're going to start with the Red List report of threatened species published by the IUCN in 1966, which essentially it's very popular now, but it's a comprehensive inventory with the status of species, and it's constantly updated to include endangered species as well as potentially not endangered species that are potentially threatened and stuff like that. In September of 1986, we have the National Forum on Biodiversity that was hosted in Washington, D.C., which was essentially just several panels from scientists literally on biodiversity, but it also linked biodiversity to economic statuses within different continents. There was a book created afterwards that included the reports of scientists, so if anyone wants to ever look at them, they can. In June 1992 through 1993, we actually had the Convention on Biological Diversity as well. But the convention is a multilateral treaty, and it was opened at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, but it was signed in 1993. And it basically talks about biodiversity, sustainability, and equity, and is a treaty for those. There's more details to it, and I don't exactly remember who all signed the treaty. But it kind of becomes prominent when you look at later dates as well. In 2019, we had the Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which essentially was just a report on the human impact and how it was negatively affecting biodiversity. I remember it specifically mentioning percentages on like biomass loss between amphibians, mammals, stuff like that. It was essentially a summary for policymakers. And then in sort of more recent events, we've got September in 2020, there was the 5th Global Diversity Outlook Report, which reflects on previous projections. And basically, as a summary, it said, we can't be doing business as usual. We have to change, or else biodiversity is going to be very negatively impacted. Now, we talk about biodiversity and we talk about species biodiversity, but what can cause a lack of biodiversity or a loss of biodiversity? There's a lot of things that can cause a loss of biodiversity. In a very broad example, you could literally have just a mass extinction event, a volcanic eruption, stuff like that. But what is currently going on? An example, humans have a tendency to overuse lands and resources. An example would be grazing, where one report I found that grazing across an area overall decreased biodiversity. And over on Lookout Mountain, which is kind of an area where some cattle grazes, you can see that, especially in the lower part where actual cattle can get to, the biodiversity amongst plant species and specifically grass species isn't as prominent. And depending on how farmers allow their cattle to graze, if they allow them to graze improperly, certain areas can no longer grow back after grazing. So deforestation is another example that humans have essentially created. As the Amazonia's forest has become more widely used, biodiversity has decreased, and that is likely due to tree canopies, and as well as the fact that trees provide certain resources for different creatures there. Grasses might be more likely to grow in areas with less trees, but grass isn't necessarily a good indicator for biodiversity. Climate change is another cause, which brief broad overview. Temperatures can affect animals, specifically animals and even plants, depending on whether or not an area becomes more dry or becomes more wet. An example, and I'm taking a lot of these from my agricology class, is common reed, which is Phragmites australis. There's two varieties, which are more wetland grasses, but if the area becomes more dry for whatever reason, obviously those grasses are probably less likely to grow. You've got things like 6 weeks fescue, which grow in 6 weeks but require moisture to grow. So essentially there's a loss of habitat, and if you lose one thing, chances are you're going to start losing a chain of other things. Invasive species is another thing that we can talk about when it comes to potential causes of loss of biodiversity, and which is essentially species can outcompete other species. An example, no two species can have the same exact niche, or else one has to outcompete the other. Zebra mussels, which is something we talked about in presentations and in class, is an example of this. But you can even potentially look at, I think it's pythons in Florida. Pythons in Florida, they're starting to become an invasive species. And you've even got them moving more northward despite temperature differences. So they're going to essentially help take out biodiversity that way. Now, biodiversity is great not only for wildlife itself, but for humans, because it can become an ecological need in a way, if that makes sense. The whole premise of biodiversity is that it helps fill multiple roles, and if you lose a certain role, there might be other roles that no longer function. An example of something coming back to fill a role that was once filled includes wolves that were reintroduced in Yellowstone National Park. And it caused an entire trophic cascade. Once you reintroduce wolves in Yellowstone National Park, you got more ungulates, aka like deer and stuff like that, grazing less. So there was more vegetation near riverbanks and stuff like that. So there was more stability amongst riverbanks and long story short, you've got more roots going there so that riverbanks are much more stable. More things can grow there, and then you've got more creatures that are suddenly coming back because they've got more vegetation there. But this does go beyond the eye. Some people don't think about soil biodiversity, and in one of the reports that is mentioned in the sources, says that soil positively affects temporal stability in an area, which essentially means that the less biodiversity you have in the soil, biomass for plants decreases, and we know that biomass for plants affects herbivores, and then the energy production from herbivores goes down. Not only that, some creatures heavily rely on certain plants because they don't have awns or bristles or things that defend themselves. An example, the switchgrass that I randomly have on my bed. So it's a balancing equation. It affects us greatly, but it affects wildlife around us. So that means less resources of certain things, such as vegetation and forests, or even just overall biomass from vegetation. This is the hardest part of this, is because how do you create solutions for a problem that's getting bigger, and for not only that, for a problem that it has multiple dimensions attached to it? Well, for starters, you got to think of solutions from the human standpoint. Obviously, you cannot just cut dry everything and stop everything, because humans have sadly become dependent on certain things. One of those One of the things we can do includes freshwater solutions. Humans have greatly affected water flow, alter the way water flows, especially with dams and other water constructs. So we would have to carefully alter that in a way. You would also have to improve water quality because we've also not done great with water quality, which affects wildlife in freshwater. A great thing to do would be to put more protections on freshwater habitats. And invasive species management, making sure people that take boats in and out of lakes and stuff like that actually properly clean their boats and stuff like that. One thing to do is that one of the other reports I found mentioned that biodiversity and climate change are inherently linked, but obviously you hear more about climate change than you do biodiversity. So one thing is just pretty much setting the light on biodiversity, making sure people know more about biodiversity. And an example, talking about diseases and biodiversity, how if you have a lack of biodiversity in crop life, that will increase the diseases in certain crop life and stuff like that. And create inclusive policies that don't just focus on climate change but also biodiversity. In a general sense, those solutions come down to more education, more advocacy, and more attention for biodiversity. The education's a big point because anytime I talk to someone about biodiversity and I start explaining these random but important parts, they don't have a complete understanding of biodiversity because it's just so overlooked in the grand scheme of things, strangely. And these are my sources for this biodiversity presentation. I don't even know if I made it past 10 minutes, but it was very hard to even think about making it to 10 minutes. So have a good day. How do I stop recording? Yeah.